Hey everyone. Today we dive into the most terrifying unsolved mystery in criminal history. The story of Jack the Ripper, a killer whose identity has haunted investigators for over 130 years and whose name still sends chills down spines around the world. What's going to blow your mind is that, despite having more evidence, more suspects, and more theories than almost any other case in history, we're no closer to knowing who this monster actually was than we were in 1888. The incredible story of Jack the Ripper isn't just about the murders that terrorized London. It's about how one person managed to completely vanish from history while leaving behind the most infamous legacy in true crime. So before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now get comfortable, grab something to drink, and let's experience this incredible story together, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about the world's most notorious serial killer. Picture this: it's August 31st, 1888, and the sun is setting over the grimy streets of Whitechapel, London. The air is thick with coal smoke and the stench of poverty. But there's something else in the atmosphere tonight, something that makes even the hardened residents of this desperate district lock their doors a little tighter. Mary Ann Nichols, a 43-year-old woman struggling to survive on these brutal streets, has no idea that in just a few hours, she'll become the first confirmed victim of a killer who will terrorize an entire city and puzzle the world for centuries to come. But here's what makes this story absolutely mind-blowing. Jack the Ripper didn't just kill 5 women and disappear into the night. He created the world's first media sensation around a serial killer, wrote taunting letters to police and newspapers, and somehow managed to commit his crimes in one of the most densely populated areas of London, without a single reliable witness ever seeing his face clearly enough to identify him. We're talking about a killer who operated in streets so narrow you could touch both sides with outstretched arms, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business, and yet he became a ghost. When Mary Ann Nichols' body was discovered on Bucks Row at 3:40 a.m., the sight was so horrific that even the hardened police constable who found her had to steady himself against a wall. Her throat had been slashed twice so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. But that wasn't all. The killer had also made deep abdominal cuts with surgical precision, and this detail would become crucial to understanding just how calculating and methodical this monster really was. What the police didn't realize at that moment was that they were looking at the handiwork of someone who would make Whitechapel the most famous district in London for all the wrong reasons. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was the opening act of a horror show that would grip not just London, but the entire world. 8 days later, on September 8th, Annie Chapman became the second victim, and this is where the story takes its first truly chilling turn. Chapman's body was found in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and the killer had clearly spent considerable time with his victim. The mutilations were far more extensive than those inflicted on Nichols, and here's the detail that sent investigators into a complete panic. Personal items belonging to Chapman had been carefully arranged around her body in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern. This wasn't random violence, this was ritualistic. Dr. George Baxter Phillips, the police surgeon who examined Chapman's body, made an observation that would haunt the investigation for decades to come. He stated that the killer possessed anatomical knowledge and surgical skill, suggesting that Jack the Ripper might be a doctor, a butcher, or someone with medical training. But here's where things get really interesting. Phillips also noted that despite the extensive mutilations, there was remarkably little blood at the scene, indicating that the killer knew exactly how to position the body to minimize blood flow. We're talking about someone with not just knowledge but practical experience in handling human anatomy. The media frenzy that followed these first 2 murders was unlike anything London had ever seen. Newspapers were selling out daily as people desperately sought updates on the case. Street vendors were making more money selling papers than they'd ever made before, and the name Whitechapel became synonymous with terror throughout Britain. But the killer wasn't content to let the media speculate about his identity. He wanted to control the narrative himself. On September 27th, the Central News Agency received a letter that would change everything. Written in red ink and signed Jack the Ripper, it was the first time this infamous name appeared anywhere. The letter taunted police, promised more murders, and was written in a tone that was both educated and menacing. But here's what makes this letter absolutely fascinating. Handwriting experts have spent over a century analyzing it, and they still can't agree on whether it was written by the actual killer or by a journalist looking to sell more newspapers. The letter read, in part, "I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled. Grand work the last job was. I gave the lady no time to squeal." What's truly spine-chilling about this letter is how it demonstrates the killer's complete confidence in his ability to evade capture. This wasn't someone running scared or hiding in the shadows. This was someone who genuinely believed he was untouchable, and as the investigation would prove, he was absolutely right. Then came September 30th, 1888, a night that would become known as the Double Event, and it's here that Jack the Ripper truly cemented his place in criminal history. In the span of just 45 minutes, he killed 2 women, Elizabeth Stride at 1 a.m. and Catherine Eddowes at 1:45 a.m. But here's what makes this night so incredibly significant. The killer was interrupted while mutilating Stride, possibly by the arrival of a cart, and instead of fleeing the area entirely, he moved just over half a mile away and killed again, this time completing his ritualistic mutilations on Eddowes. The audacity of this double murder sent shockwaves through London. Police had increased patrols, citizens were forming vigilante groups, and reward money was being offered from multiple sources. Yet Jack the Ripper had managed to kill twice in one night in different locations, each time escaping without being seen. The killer wasn't just evading capture, he was making the entire Metropolitan Police Force look incompetent. But the double event revealed something else crucial about our killer's psychology. After murdering Catherine Eddowes, he took a piece of her bloodied apron with him as he fled. About 30 minutes later, this piece of apron was found on Golston Street, and written on the wall above it in chalk were the words, "Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren ordered this graffiti to be erased immediately, fearing it would incite anti-Semitic riots, but this decision would haunt the investigation forever because it destroyed what might have been the only physical evidence directly linking Jack the Ripper to his crimes. Now, to understand what happened next, we need to go back to the question that was consuming everyone in London: who was this monster? By October 1888, the police were drowning in tips, confessions, and theories. Over 2,000 people were interviewed, 300 were investigated as potential suspects, and 80 were detained, but not a single arrest led anywhere concrete. The killer seemed to anticipate every move the police made. Here's where the story gets even more bizarre. On October 16th, George Lusk, the chairman of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, received a small package at his home. Inside was half of a human kidney, a nasal, haint alam. The letter claimed that the other half of the kidney had been fried and ate by the sender, and that this kidney had been taken from Catherine Eddowes. Medical examination couldn't definitively prove the kidney came from Eddowes, but it was from a person of approximately her age and showed signs of kidney disease, which Eddowes was known to have suffered from. Think about the psychological warfare at play here. Jack the Ripper wasn't just killing, he was taunting the very people trying to catch him, sending them pieces of his victims while claiming to have consumed human organs. This level of calculated cruelty goes far beyond typical serial killer behavior and suggests someone with an almost supernatural level of confidence in their ability to avoid capture. The fifth and final confirmed victim was Mary Jane Kelly, killed on November 9, 1888, and her murder was so brutal that crime scene photographs from that day are still considered too graphic to display publicly. Kelly was killed in her own room at 13 Miller's Court, and unlike the previous victims who were murdered quickly in public spaces, the killer spent hours with Kelly's body. The mutilations were so extensive that she was barely recognizable as human, and the killer had even taken the time to build up the fire in her room, possibly to provide better light for his work. What they discovered changed everything about how investigators understood Jack the Ripper. The sheer amount of time the killer spent with Kelly's body, the methodical nature of the mutilations, and the fact that he was able to work undisturbed for hours in a building where other people were sleeping just feet away, demonstrated a level of nerve and control that defied explanation. This wasn't someone in the grip of uncontrollable rage, this was someone who could turn his violence on and off like a switch. But here's the most haunting aspect of Mary Kelly's murder. It was the last confirmed Jack the Ripper killing. After spending months terrorizing London, after taunting police and media, after building up to this crescendo of violence with Kelly, the killer simply vanished. No more murders with his signature mutilations, no more letters, no more media attention. It was as if Jack the Ripper had simply decided he was finished and walked away from the most notorious killing spree in history. The story takes an even stranger turn when you realize how many people have been suspected of being Jack the Ripper over the years. The list reads like a who's who of Victorian London society and includes everyone from local butchers to members of the royal family. There's Montague John Druitt, a barrister and teacher who committed suicide shortly after the Kelly murder, found floating in the Thames with stones in his pockets. Police officials at the time considered him a strong suspect, but there's no physical evidence linking him to any of the crimes. Then there's Aaron Kosminski, a Polish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel and was later committed to an asylum. In 2014, DNA analysis of a shawl allegedly found at the Catherine Eddowes crime scene seemed to point to Kosminski, but the methodology and chain of custody of this evidence has been heavily criticized by forensic experts. The shawl had passed through multiple hands over 125 years, making any DNA findings essentially meaningless. One of the most fascinating suspects is Dr. Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor who was in London during the murders and fled to the United States immediately after Kelly's death. Tumblety had a documented hatred of women, possessed anatomical knowledge, and was known to collect human organs in jars. He was even arrested in London during the Jack the Ripper investigation, though officially for gross indecency rather than murder. After his release, he immediately left the country, and the murders stopped. But despite all these coincidences, there's still no direct evidence linking him to the crimes. Perhaps the most outlandish theory involves Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, who was allegedly part of a royal conspiracy to cover up his involvement with a Catholic shopgirl. This theory suggests that Jack the Ripper's victims were killed to silence them about the prince's secret marriage and child. While this makes for compelling fiction, there's absolutely no credible evidence supporting it, and the prince's whereabouts during several of the murders have been well documented as being far from London. What's absolutely mind-blowing is that in an age before DNA testing, fingerprinting, or modern forensic science, Jack the Ripper managed to commit his crimes in a way that left virtually no usable physical evidence. But even more incredible is that with all our modern technology, all our advanced investigative techniques, and all the attention that's been focused on this case, we're still no closer to definitively identifying him. Here's what makes the Jack the Ripper case so uniquely frustrating for investigators. There's almost too much evidence. Over 130 years, the case files have grown to include thousands of documents, hundreds of photographs, dozens of alleged suspect profiles, and countless witness statements. But the sheer volume of information has created its own problem. Every piece of evidence can be interpreted multiple ways. Every witness statement conflicts with others, and every theory about the killer's identity can be both supported and debunked using the same set of facts. Consider this: we know Jack the Ripper was skilled with a knife, suggesting medical or butchering experience. But in Victorian London, basic surgical knowledge was much more common than today. Barbers performed minor surgeries, veterinarians worked on large animals, and many working-class men had experience slaughtering animals for food. This one clue, which seemed so specific in 1888, actually applies to hundreds of potential suspects. We know he was familiar with the streets of Whitechapel, able to navigate the maze-like alleys and courts, even in complete darkness. But Whitechapel was one of the most densely populated areas in London, home to thousands of people who knew every inch of the neighborhood. Again, this narrows down the suspect pool, but not nearly enough to be useful. We know he was able to approach his victims without alarming them, suggesting he appeared harmless or was someone they recognized. But the victims were all women working in prostitution, women who by necessity had to trust strangers with their lives every night just to survive. This tells us almost nothing about the killer's appearance or social status. What they discovered changed everything about how we think about unsolved cases. Jack the Ripper created the template for the modern serial killer investigation, but he also demonstrated how someone with sufficient intelligence and luck could potentially evade capture indefinitely. He understood that, in the crowded, chaotic environment of Victorian Whitechapel, anonymity was possible if you were careful enough. But here's where things get really interesting. Some experts believe that Jack the Ripper's ability to avoid capture wasn't just about luck or skill. They theorize that he had inside knowledge of police procedures, possibly because he was a police officer himself, or because he had connections within the investigation. This would explain how he always seemed to be one step ahead of the authorities, how he knew when and where to strike to avoid patrols, and how he managed to escape even when police were flooding the area within minutes of his crimes. Detective Inspector Frederick Aberline, who led much of the Jack the Ripper investigation, spent years pursuing this case and interviewed hundreds of potential witnesses and suspects. In his later years, he expressed the opinion that Jack the Ripper was likely someone with medical knowledge who had connections to the local area but wasn't necessarily from the lowest social classes. Aberline believed the killer was intelligent, well-organized, and possibly had legitimate reasons to be on the streets of Whitechapel at night, which would have made him invisible to police patrols. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Jack the Ripper's crimes is both fascinating and terrifying. This was someone who could compartmentalize extreme violence, who could walk away from butchering a human being and return to normal social interactions without arousing suspicion. The methodical nature of the mutilations suggests someone who is sexually motivated by violence, but the ability to stop killing entirely after Mary Kelly suggests someone with remarkable self-control. We're looking at a person who could satisfy whatever psychological need was driving him to kill, and then simply choose to stop. Modern criminal profilers who have studied the Jack the Ripper case believe he was likely a local man, probably in his 20s or 30s, with some medical or anatomical knowledge, and possessed of an appearance that wouldn't alarm potential victims. He was probably employed in some capacity that required him to be out at night, explaining how he could move through the streets without drawing police attention. Most importantly, he was someone who understood the rhythms of Whitechapel life well enough to predict when and where he could commit his crimes without being caught. But even this profile, developed using modern psychological techniques, describes thousands of men who lived in London in 1888. The killer's greatest achievement wasn't just evading capture, it was making himself so perfectly ordinary that he could hide in plain sight among the masses of Victorian London. Now, what really happened during those final months of 1888 that allowed Jack the Ripper to simply vanish? There are several theories, and each one is more chilling than the last. The first possibility is that he died, either naturally, by suicide, or by accident, shortly after the Kelly murder. This would explain the sudden cessation of the crimes, but it also means that one of history's most notorious killers took his identity to the grave, denying closure to the families of his victims and to history itself. The second possibility is that he was committed to an asylum, either for mental illness unrelated to the murders or because his behavior became erratic enough to draw attention. Victorian asylums were notorious for their poor record-keeping, and many patient records from that era have been lost or destroyed. If Jack the Ripper spent his final years in an institution, raving about his crimes to doctors who dismissed his confessions as delusions, we might never know. The third, and perhaps most disturbing possibility, is that Jack the Ripper simply decided to stop killing and successfully return to normal life. This theory suggests that he satisfied whatever psychological need was driving him to murder, or that the increased police attention made the risk too great, and he consciously chose to end his killing spree. If this is true, then Jack the Ripper lived out his natural life as an ordinary citizen, carrying the secret of his crimes to his grave, and possibly even taking satisfaction in watching the decades-long investigation fail to identify him. There's also the possibility that he left London entirely, either moving to another part of Britain or emigrating to another country. In the 1880s, record-keeping for population movements was relatively primitive, and it would have been entirely possible for someone to simply disappear into the masses of people constantly moving between cities and countries. If Jack the Ripper reinvented himself elsewhere, he could have lived an entirely different life, while his crimes continued to baffle investigators thousands of miles away. The story they never told you about Jack the Ripper is that his greatest crime wasn't just the 5 murders he committed, but the way he demonstrated that in the right circumstances, someone could commit the most notorious crimes in history and simply vanish without a trace. He proved that anonymity was possible even in one of the world's largest cities, that intelligence and careful planning could triumph over even the most determined police investigation. What's truly haunting is that Jack the Ripper created the blueprint for the perfect crime. He selected victims from a marginalized population that police were less motivated to protect. He operated in an area where violence was common enough that his initial crimes didn't immediately alarm authorities. He used methods that destroyed physical evidence, and he had the discipline to stop before investigators could narrow their focus enough to identify him. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Jack the Ripper case is what it reveals about the nature of evil itself. This wasn't someone driven by passion, desperation, or mental illness in any way that we typically understand it. This was someone who made calculated decisions about when, where, and how to kill. Someone who could control his urges when necessary and unleash them when the circumstances were right. Jack the Ripper represents the possibility that true evil can be completely rational, perfectly controlled, and utterly invisible. The real story of Jack the Ripper is stranger than fiction because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth that some mysteries are designed never to be solved. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every suspect profile has been analyzed and reanalyzed for over a century, and yet we're no closer to knowing his identity than we were in 1888. This isn't because the investigation was inadequate or because the evidence was insufficient. It's because Jack the Ripper was simply better at hiding his identity than anyone was at uncovering it. Consider the staggering resources that have been devoted to solving this case over the past 130 years. Professional detectives, amateur investigators, forensic scientists, historians, psychologists, and countless authors have dedicated their careers to identifying Jack the Ripper. Advanced DNA analysis has been attempted on alleged evidence. Computer modeling has been used to analyze crime patterns, and modern psychological profiling techniques have been applied to Victorian-era behavior patterns. Yet despite all this effort, all this expertise, and all this technology, the killer's identity remains as mysterious today as it was on November 9, 1888. This level of sustained anonymity in the face of such intensive investigation is almost unprecedented in criminal history. The most unsolved cases from the Victorian era remain unsolved because they lacked sufficient attention or resources. The Jack the Ripper case is unique because it has received more attention and resources than almost any other criminal investigation in history, yet it remains completely unsolved. What you won't believe is how Jack the Ripper continues to influence our understanding of criminal investigation even today. The methods developed to investigate his crimes led directly to modern forensic techniques, criminal profiling, and media management during high-profile cases. Police departments around the world still study the Jack the Ripper investigation as an example of how not to handle a serial killer case, particularly regarding evidence preservation and media relations. The letters allegedly sent by Jack the Ripper established the template for how serial killers interact with media and law enforcement. The taunting tone, the promises of future violence, the claims of superiority over investigators. All of these elements have been repeated by killers throughout history, who were clearly inspired by the Jack the Ripper model. In a very real sense, Jack the Ripper didn't just kill 5 women in Victorian London, he created a new category of criminal behavior that continues to influence violent crime today. But here's what makes the continued mystery so particularly maddening. Jack the Ripper wasn't trying to create an unsolvable puzzle. He was simply trying to avoid being caught, just like any other criminal. The fact that his efforts were so completely successful that they've thwarted investigation for over a century suggests either incredible luck or incredible skill, and after studying this case for so long, investigators tend to believe it was primarily skill. Everything you thought you knew about this case is probably wrong because most people focus on the gore and the mystery while missing the true horror of Jack the Ripper. He is absolute normality. This wasn't a monster lurking in the shadows or a madman raving in the streets. This was someone who could commit the most brutal crimes imaginable and then return to normal social interactions without anyone suspecting. He was your neighbor, your coworker, someone you might have shared a drink with at the pub. Someone who helped old ladies cross the street and wished you good morning on his way to work. The most terrifying aspect of Jack the Ripper isn't that he killed 5 women in particularly brutal ways. It's that he demonstrated how someone could harbor the darkest possible impulses while presenting a completely normal facade to the world. He proved that we can never really know the people around us, that evil can wear the most ordinary mask, and that our assumptions about what killers look like and how they behave are completely wrong. Modern criminal psychologists who study the Jack the Ripper case often focus on this aspect of his crimes, the ability to compartmentalize extreme violence and maintain normal social functioning. This characteristic is found in many successful serial killers, but Jack the Ripper may have been the first to demonstrate it so completely. He created the template for the serial killer, who hides in plain sight, who kills not because he's obviously mentally ill or socially dysfunctional, but because he chooses to kill while remaining perfectly capable of normal behavior. The unbelievable events surrounding Jack the Ripper's disappearance have created one of the most enduring mysteries in human history, but they've also created something else: the perfect unsolved case. Jack the Ripper has become more famous than any captured serial killer precisely because he was never caught. His anonymous success has made him legendary in a way that identification and punishment never could have achieved. Think about it. If Jack the Ripper had been caught in 1888, tried and executed, he would be remembered as just another Victorian criminal, notable mainly for the brutality of his crimes. Instead, his successful evasion of justice has made him immortal. He achieved a kind of twisted immortality by remaining forever unknown, forever mysterious, forever just beyond the reach of justice. This raises uncomfortable questions about our fascination with unsolved crimes and unknown killers. Does our continued obsession with Jack the Ripper's identity somehow reward his successful evasion of justice? Are we giving him exactly what he wanted, eternal notoriety without consequence? These questions don't have easy answers, but they help explain why this case continues to captivate us more than a century after the crimes were committed. The incredible story of Jack the Ripper ends not with resolution, but with the acknowledgement that some stories are designed never to end. He created a mystery that was meant to be permanent, a puzzle with pieces that were scattered and destroyed before anyone realized they needed to be preserved. His crimes were committed in an era when forensic science was primitive and record-keeping was inadequate, yet his disappearance was so complete that even modern technology cannot bridge the gap between 1888 and today. What really happened to Jack the Ripper after November 9, 1888, will probably never be known. He might have died the next day or lived for another 50 years. He might have been someone whose name appears in the surviving police files. Or he might have been someone who was never suspected at all. He might have been a local resident or a visitor from another country. He might have been a doctor, a butcher, a police officer, or a laborer. The only thing we know for certain is that he was human, and that his humanity is perhaps the most terrifying aspect of his crimes. Jack the Ripper succeeded in committing the perfect crime, not because he was superhuman, but because he was perfectly, ordinarily human. He understood human nature well enough to exploit its weaknesses. He understood the limitations of Victorian-era law enforcement well enough to avoid its strengths, and he understood the power of anonymity well enough to disappear completely into the masses of humanity from which he had emerged. The story of Jack the Ripper is ultimately the story of how someone can choose to become a monster while remaining invisible, how evil can flourish in plain sight, and how the most ordinary-seeming person can harbor the darkest secrets. It's a story that forces us to confront the uncomfortable possibility that we can never really know the people around us, that appearances are meaningless, and that true monsters don't look like monsters at all. In the end, Jack the Ripper's greatest achievement wasn't the 5 murders he committed in Whitechapel. It was proving that in the right circumstances, with sufficient intelligence and planning, someone can commit the most notorious crimes in history and simply walk away, in leaving behind only questions that will never be answered and a mystery that will never be solved. He demonstrated that perfect anonymity is possible, that justice is not inevitable, and that some secrets can be kept forever. The real identity of Jack the Ripper died with him, whenever and however that death occurred. His name, his face, his story, his motivations, his life before and after the murders, all of it vanished as completely as if it had never existed. He achieved something that no other criminal in history has managed: complete and permanent anonymity, despite worldwide attention and more than a century of investigation. And perhaps that's exactly what he wanted. Perhaps Jack the Ripper's final victory isn't just that he was never caught, but that he created a mystery so perfect, so complete, and so enduring that it has become more famous than any solution could ever be. He turned his crimes into legend, his anonymity into immortality, and his successful evasion of justice into the most fascinating unsolved case in human history. The man who became Jack the Ripper walked into the shadows of Victorian London and never emerged. His identity remains locked in the darkness of history, and despite everything we've learned about forensic science, criminal psychology, and investigative techniques, those shadows are as impenetrable today as they were in 1888. Jack the Ripper achieved the impossible. He committed history's most famous murders and then simply ceased to exist, leaving behind only the echo of his crimes and the eternal question of who he really was. That question has been asked every day for over 130 years, and it will probably be asked for centuries to come. Because Jack the Ripper didn't just kill 5 women in Whitechapel, he killed certainty itself, creating a mystery so perfect that it may truly be unsolvable. And in doing so, he achieved a twisted form of immortality that no captured killer could ever attain. He became the perfect criminal by becoming perfectly unknown, and that anonymity has made him more famous than any identity ever could.